The morning arrived as though it had been pressed between damp sheets, the kind of Oxford dawn that softens edges and muffles sound. I walked along St. Aldate's, the cobbles glistening with moisture from an overnight drizzle, the river a grey whisper at the periphery of my sight. Bicycles clattered in the distance, their tires leaving transient black trails, and the faint scent of wet paper drifted from the library windows. One might have thought it a typical day, yet even the most ordinary mornings possessed their peculiar disquiet, and I had learned to listen for it. My attention was caught by a minor incongruity dust tracked across the rector's polished shoes as he stepped from his lodgings. The white powder was almost imperceptible against the dark leather, yet its presence implied a disturbance, however slight. I followed the trail with quiet interest, noting the rectory door closed behind him with a faint click that resonated in the narrow street. There is a curious poetry in noticing such things. A footstep out of place, a dust mote suspended in the autumn sunlight, can signal disorder beneath a veneer of calm. Inside the college, the corridors smelled of old stone warmed by faint sunlight, mingling with the tang of books and waxed floors. I paused to glance at a notice board, a fragment of poetry pinned hastily at the top, a misquotation, subtle and tantalizing. The words pricked at some dormant thought, reminding me that even in places devoted to learning, error and misalignment persist. A small smile touched my lips. One might call it trivial, yet the mind that observes little oddities often discerns what others cannot. The rector's absence at morning service was noted, though not remarked upon. Fellows and students murmured in low tones, polite in manner but uneasy beneath their composure. I watched as a junior don adjusted his gown repeatedly, a subtle hesitation betraying more than decorum demanded. I found that the quiet gestures of men and women who consider themselves masters of propriety often reveal the hidden currents of intent, the unspoken anxieties that ripple through an academic household. Crossing the quad, the damp leaves clung to my boots, and the wind carried a faint echo of a cathedral bell. I considered the meaning of minor disruptions, the significance of a mislaid letter, a forgotten appointment, a note left on a desk that reads differently under closer scrutiny. Each is a doorway to understanding, provided one approaches without haste, with the patience to let small truths accumulate and resonate. By mid-morning, the fog had begun to lift, though a pall remained over the spires and arches. A reminder that clarity often arrives gradually, and sometimes not at all. I paused near the library doorway, observing the reflection of the rectory across the stone, noting that the faint dust pattern persisted despite careful cleaning. Such details linger, stubborn and subtle, much like the conscience of the city itself. Lewis found me there, quiet and unobtrusive as ever, though I could sense his curiosity. I offered no explanation, merely allowing my gaze to linger on the dust, on the shifting sunlight, on the silent testimonies of the morning. There is a pleasure, perhaps a melancholy one, in these small observations, for they are the seeds of insight and the first stirrings of any mystery. And it was in such subtlety that the day's events, though seemingly mundane, would begin to whisper their secrets to those willing to hear. The morning's damp had barely lifted when a note arrived at the college lodge, its edges slightly frayed, the handwriting precise but unfamiliar. I held it in my hand, turning it over as though the paper itself might reveal the author's intentions. The words were simple enough on the surface, a reminder of a forgotten promise and a fragment of verse misquoted, but in their misalignment there was a certain gravity, the sense that a mind both literary and unsettled had left a message deliberately, yet in a way that concealed more than it revealed. I tucked it into the inside pocket of my coat, noting the smell of ink and paper, the faint impression of a seal long since removed. The rector seemed untroubled when I mentioned it, adjusting his spectacles and commenting on the weather with the habitual politeness of one who has long since mastered the art of deflection. Yet his eyes lingered a moment too long on the clock above the mantel, a subtle gesture that suggested awareness without acknowledgement. There is often more to a man in the careful regulation of his movements than in the words he chooses, and I found myself quietly observing the flicker of unease behind the calm. Later, I traced the note's origin with a measured curiosity, walking the hallways where shadows pooled beneath high arches. The scent of damp stone mingled with that of polished wood, and somewhere behind a closed door a piano played softly, though no student had yet arrived. The rhythm of the morning carried a certain tension, delicate yet insistent, as if the building itself were whispering caution. I recalled a similar misquotation in an old volume tucked among the Bodleian's archives, the page margins annotated with faint, looping script. Such details, often overlooked, become significant when juxtaposed with human behavior. Lewis accompanied me to the lodge, silent in the way he sometimes is, attentive without intrusion. I noted how his eyes flickered toward the notice board, lingering on a pinned poem fragment that echoed the note's phrasing. I thought of the subtlety required to manipulate words, the way a single misquoted line can suggest meanings the author never intended. It is in these small deviations that the first traces of human intent are discernible, though one must exercise patience to see them clearly. The note seemed to unsettle more than it should have, and yet I could not say why. Each member of the college I encountered offered a mask of civility, the exchange of polite remarks and quiet smiles. I watched, however, for the small tremors beneath a pause too long, a glance diverted, the hand that trembles slightly as it adjusts a gown or repositions a book. One must attend to these gestures with the same care as any letter or manuscript. They are the punctuation of motive. I spent the afternoon retracing steps, noting the rectory doorway, the hallways where the carpet had been recently vacuumed but left a faint streak, the corner of the chapel where dust had settled unevenly. Each observation seemed trivial until the misquotation resurfaced in my mind, paired with the curl of a question mark in the sender's handwriting. There is a rhythm to such things, an almost musical quality, and in that cadence I sensed both a warning and an invitation to look closer, to consider the past in tandem with the present. By evening, the day had acquired a thin patina of anxiety, the ordinary noises of Oxford somehow sharper, as though magnified by the mind's insistence. I returned the note to my pocket, the paper warm from handling, and contemplated the subtle interplay of literary reference and human intent. The sender remained a shadow, the motive concealed beneath civility and scholarship. It was a small, ominous detail, one that would quietly unfurl its significance in the days to come, though for now it lingered in the mind like the faintest echo of a half-remembered tune. The dinner that evening was arranged with the customary precision of the college, the table set in dark wood with silver cutlery that caught the flickering candlelight just so. I arrived before the rector, allowing myself a slow appraisal of the assembled guests. One chair, positioned slightly askew as if disturbed by a hand too eager in its placement, remained empty. It was not the absence itself that troubled me, but the minor irregularities surrounding it. A half-drunk glass of claret, a napkin folded with meticulous care yet placed on the wrong side, the menu card slightly bent at the corner. Such details often speak louder than conversation. I noticed the subtle glance exchanged between two fellows seated across the table, a motion as slight as the tilt of a head or a pause in gesture, yet it suggested unease beneath the veneer of polite discourse. The rector, for his part, spoke gently of academic concerns and minor disputes over manuscript attributions, his tone measured, eyes flicking occasionally to the vacant chair. I recorded these small shifts, the faint tension that seemed to ripple in accordance with the missing guest's absence. One learns in Oxford that such nuances often carry the weight of motive, the silent architecture of intention. Lewis, as ever, remained quiet beside me, observing with the patience of someone trained to note without interference. I found myself attentive to gestures the way a hand lingered on the stem of a glass, the careful arrangement of silverware, the fleeting furrow of a brow. There is a rhythm to propriety, and when it falters, however subtly, it provides a path for observation. The missing guest's absence created an invisible pressure, a quiet space that seemed to amplify minor tremors in manner and expression. The conversation drifted toward recent lectures and literary quarrels, punctuated by polite laughter and restrained humor. Yet in the midst of this, I detected a slight hesitation from a junior don when the rector mentioned a line from Shelley. It was an almost imperceptible pause, a misplacement of emphasis, but enough to draw my attention. I recalled the note from the morning, the misquoted poetry, and a small spark of recognition. Flared patterns often recur in human behavior, echoing from one gesture or word to another. The misquotation in the note might have been intended to unsettle, yet it now seemed connected to the subtle inflection of the absent guest's confidence. Halfway through the meal, I permitted myself to glance at the floorboards beneath the table. There was a faint scuff mark, a dust streak that suggested someone had moved hurriedly, yet with an effort to avoid notice. I considered the possibility that the absent guest had arrived and departed without attracting attention, though no one admitted to seeing them. The timing of movements, the arrangement of objects, and the direction of glances all pointed to the careful orchestration of concealment. As dessert was served, a modest tart with custard, I noted the rector's own eyes drift toward the empty chair with a mixture of concern and something more private, perhaps an anticipation of news yet to arrive. There is often a tension between social obligation and personal regard, and it is in these spaces that motives begin to take shape. I observed the way a cup was lifted, a spoon set down, the subtlest of hesitations that betrays internal calculation. By the end of the meal, the absence had begun to feel almost corporeal, a presence of its own that altered the flow of conversation and the weight of scrutiny. I understood, quietly, that what was missing might matter far more than what was present. Small inconsistencies accumulate until a pattern emerges, and in that accumulation lay the first suggestion of inquiry. As I rose from the table, the candlelight flickered across the polished silver, and I sensed that the night's shadows were only beginning to deepen, that the missing guest had left more than a vacant chair. They had left questions waiting to be answered. The library was quiet in a way that made the absence of sound almost tangible, the hush of stone walls and high windows pressing upon the senses. Evening light filtered through leaded panes, pooling unevenly across the worn reading tables, and the faint scent of old paper and polish mingled with the subtle dampness of the Oxford air. I moved slowly along the stacks, noting the precise arrangement of volumes, the faint tilt of a spine here or there, as though the books themselves bore witness to the passage of human attention. There is a rhythm in such observation, a cadence that informs one more than conversation ever could. I paused at a particular shelf where an old diary, misfiled and half-hidden, caught my eye. The leather was cracked along the spine, the page edges uneven, suggesting frequent handling despite the years. Leafing through it, I noted references to disputes among fellows, small grievances recorded in faint script, and marginalia that hinted at long-forgotten secrets. One note in particular, a mention of an unpublished poem, echoed the misquotation from the morning's note. The alignment of word and gesture, of manuscript and human intent, began to form a faint but persistent pattern in my mind. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, drew my attention, a floorboard creaking somewhere behind the stacks. I paused, listening, and the echo seemed magnified in the vaulted space. There was no student, no orderly, yet the library held the unmistakable whisper of movement. I traced the sound, noting the direction, the soft disturbance of dust along the skirting boards, the faint impression of footsteps that did not align with the evening's legitimate traffic. It was a minor anomaly, trivial to most, but for me it suggested careful orchestration, the deliberate placement of presence and absence. Lewis arrived quietly. His steps measured, and we exchanged no words, allowing the library itself to communicate its subtleties. I returned to the diary, comparing the marginal note to a small crossword clue I had seen in the Times that morning, a wordplay involving shadows and concealment. The coincidence was telling both the note and the diary hinted at what was not openly acknowledged. In Oxford, as elsewhere, subtlety is often the language of intent, and one must attend to it with patience and an ear for cadence. A young don appeared at the end of the aisle, glancing at the diary and offering a polite, constrained smile. His fingers twitched briefly as he adjusted his gown, a detail so slight it might have escaped notice entirely. Yet it aligned with the subtle tremor I had observed at dinner, the faint tension surrounding absent presences. I made a note, in my mind, of the confluence of gestures, recognizing that human behavior often betrays itself in repeated, almost imperceptible ways. I lingered in the reading room, absorbing the muted interplay of light and shadow, the soft weight of history pressing against the present. The diary remained open, a repository of what had been said and what had been concealed, and I traced a finger along a particular line, noting the curvature of the script. It suggested a hand, both careful and practiced, capable of concealment yet prone to inadvertent revelation. Such hands leave traces that a patient observer may read as one reads the margins of a manuscript or the echo of a misquoted verse. By the time we departed, the library had settled into deeper silence, the shadows lengthening across the polished tables and marble floors. I carried the diary with me, noting the persistent interplay of past and present and the faint pattern of omission that seemed to haunt its pages. In such spaces, where light is uneven and sound restrained, human intent manifests in minor discrepancies, footprints in dust, a misfiled manuscript, a tremor of gesture. And it is in observing these that a quiet understanding begins to form the first subtle threads of a mystery that will, inevitably, demand closer attention. The quad that afternoon was tinged with the melancholy of autumn, leaves clinging to the stone and scuttling across the flagstones with every breath of wind. I walked slowly, letting my eyes drift over the familiar arches and cloisters, noting the play of light against the carved faces of saints and scholars alike. The air carried the faint scent of damp grass and the musty perfume of long-closed books, and somewhere beyond the library windows a clock struck with measured solemnity. It was in these quiet, understated moments that Oxford's secrets often revealed themselves. I overheard fragments of conversation between students and fellows, murmured not in malice but in the careful weaving of gossip and half-truths. The absent dinner guest lingered in the periphery of my thoughts, and I noticed the subtle shifts in posture, the quickened glances, the faint tension that accompanies unspoken knowledge. One fellow's hand brushed a branch as he passed beneath an overhanging tree, the motion almost casual, yet the dust left upon his sleeve suggested he had lingered where he should not have. Small anomalies accumulate into patterns if one observes with patience. A young woman, a student of some reputation for literary aptitude, spoke softly to a companion, quoting a line from Shelley, yet her phrasing differed slightly from the original. The misquotation echoed the earlier note and the marginalia in the diary I'd examined, and a thought stirred that perhaps these deviations were not accidental. Words, when altered subtly, can carry meaning beyond their apparent innocence, especially when delivered with the air of casual erudition. I filed the observation quietly, committing the cadence and inflection to memory. The shadow of a passer-by stretched across the courtyard, falling momentarily upon the stone cross before merging with the lengthening dusk. I noted the direction of his steps, the slight hesitancy in pace as if he were aware of being watched, or perhaps aware of watching another. Human behavior leaves traces, even when cloaked in propriety. A tilt of the head, a pause mid-step, a glance that lingers too long. These are the subtleties that speak to motive, to concealed purpose. Lewis, walking beside me, pointed out a subtle irregularity in the alignment of paving stones, where the edge of one had been displaced and yet reseated. He suggested nothing, simply noted it. My attention drifted to the pattern of dust and wear along the pathway, recalling the streak upon the rector's shoes days earlier. The echo of absence, of subtle intrusion, seemed to repeat itself in layers throughout the college. It is in noticing these repetitions that insight begins to crystallize. A conversation nearby ended abruptly as a bell rang from the chapel tower, startling a pair of fellows mid-remark. Their laughter, slightly too high-pitched, seemed an attempt to mask something. I observed the faint tension in their gestures, the way one adjusted a sleeve, the other flicked at a leaf caught in the hem of his gown. Small tremors of human anxiety rarely escape the careful observer, and the quad offered a perfect theatre for their unspoken concerns. As I traced my steps along the perimeter, I considered the interplay of absence and presence, of light and shadow. The missing dinner guest, the misquoted lines, the displaced dust, and the subtle gestures all whispered a quiet narrative that required patience to decipher. By the time the sun had fallen behind the spire, I was left with the sense that the quad itself held knowledge, that the architecture and movement, the collisions of intention and carelessness, had a voice, if one could hear it. And it was in such whispers, faint yet persistent, that the first outlines of understanding began to emerge, delicate and haunting, ready to be pursued further in the silent corridors of the night. The rector's study was a room of quiet concentration, the sort of place that bears the weight of habit and intellect. Polished wood reflected the late afternoon light filtering through heavy curtains, and the faint tang of old leather mingled with the aroma of ink and dust. Books lined every wall, some arranged with fastidious care, others slightly askew, as though recently consulted and hastily replaced. I noted the minutiae, a pencil lying at an improbable angle on a ledge, a blot of ink just above the margin of a ledger, a chair positioned slightly off-center. These were trifles, perhaps, but in Oxford, trifles accumulate into meaning. I found a letter tucked between ledgers, its envelope unremarkable, but the contents slightly misaligned on the page. At first glance, it appeared innocuous, a simple note regarding college business. But a second reading revealed subtleties. The phrasing seemed formal, yet hinted at tension. The choice of words deliberately precise, yet slightly off-kilter. I traced a finger over a smudge of ink, wondering whether it was the result of haste or deliberate concealment. Such minutiae are rarely accidental, and I filed it away, a quiet spark of curiosity taking root. The rector entered silently, his presence calm, though the slight lift of an eyebrow betrayed awareness. He commented on the weather with the habitual polish of a man accustomed to conversation as ritual, yet I noted the small gestures, the careful placement of spectacles on a ledge, the gentle touch of a hand upon the spine of a book, the way he adjusted a paperweight as though testing the steadiness of the room itself. These were subtle indicators of an ordered mind, yet not entirely free from concern. Lewis lingered near the doorway, quietly noting the alignment of furniture and books, his presence both unobtrusive and attentive. I allowed my attention to drift to the placement of volumes on the shelves, comparing the positions with the letter in hand. One tome in particular, an old volume of poetry, was marked at a page that contained a fragment of a misquoted verse. The coincidence was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it mirrored the misquotation in the morning's note. The alignment of literary reference and human behavior seemed intentional, a small but deliberate echo that suggested hidden significance. I studied the chair, noticing faint impressions on the seat and the wear of the armrests. Someone had lingered here, reading, perhaps even observing, their presence almost invisible yet detectable to an eye trained for detail. The interplay of shadow, light, and object suggested a narrative beyond the surface of routine correspondence. Patterns often hide in plain sight, awaiting the patience to be discerned. By the time I left, the day had begun to wane, the light softening across the study and settling into shadows. The letter remained with me. The diary in my thoughts and the subtle cues of the room formed a quiet mosaic of potential insight. Even the smallest details smudge, a slight displacement of a book, the inflection of a gesture could point toward intention. In Oxford, where decorum masks anxiety and tradition cloaks motive, the attentive observer is rewarded by whispers of truth amid the ordinary. The Rector's study offered its own quiet lessons in observation, hinting at complexities yet to be fully understood. The day unfolded with a deceptive clarity, as though every sign pointed toward a tidy conclusion. Yet beneath the surface, I sensed the carefully constructed nature of the apparent evidence, the way in which appearances were arranged to mislead. The first of these misleading threads concerned a misattributed quotation, a line from Keats that had circulated in lecture notes and casual conversation. It was elegant, polished, and entirely convincing, the sort of error that tempts even a careful observer into misplaced certainty. At a lunch gathering, I noted how one of the fellows, when the line was recited, allowed his eyes to flick toward the margins of a manuscript, the faintest hesitation betraying a careful attempt to appear unconcerned. Gestures and expressions, subtle and precise, were often more revealing than words themselves. The second red herring emerged from the library archives. A forged ledger entry suggested a donation of significance that had never occurred. The document was pristine, ink evenly applied, and one could imagine how the casual observer would accept it as genuine. A junior, Don, eager to confirm what he believed was the truth, offered an affirmation that, at first glance, seemed to seal the matter. Yet I noticed minor discrepancies: the slight tilt of a signature, a misalignment of date, the way the young man's hands fidgeted as he answered my indirect questioning. These small tremors of behavior hinted at a complexity beyond the straightforward narrative. I wandered the cloisters in quiet contemplation, the echo of my footsteps mingling with the rustle of leaves and the faint trickle of water from a distant fountain. Each misdirection, each false lead, carried its own rhythm, a cadence of distraction designed to lure the investigator away from subtler truths. I allowed myself to observe, not act, noting how the shadows shifted, how the patterns of dust along the edges of the corridor told of presence and absence. Even the smallest inconsistencies, the smudge of ink, the misaligned book, the tilt of a head accumulated to suggest intent. Lewis accompanied me silently, noting the dust streak at the threshold of a doorway, the faint indentation where a chair had been moved. We exchanged no words, allowing the library itself to speak through its minutiae. It is in these quiet observations that one discerns the distinction between appearance and reality. The elegance of a red herring lies not merely in its plausibility, but in the precision of its construction, in the way it resonates with expectation, and yet diverges from truth. Later, I considered the psychology behind the deception. Pride, rivalry, and the desire to maintain reputation are powerful motivators, particularly in a scholarly environment. One can fabricate evidence, misquote a verse, or manipulate a ledger with sufficient skill to satisfy intellectual expectation. Yet, invariably, subtle errors betray the artificer, a glance held too long, a hesitation in phrasing, a gesture repeated when no one is watching. It is these minute dissonances that ultimately distinguish the genuine from the contrived. By evening, I had retraced every movement, revisited every clue, and yet the false leads remained compelling to those less attuned to nuance. The misattributed quotation and forged entry were clever diversions, intellectual traps set to test observation and patience. And still, beneath their polished surfaces, I sensed the persistence of genuine human traces, fingerprints in dust, faint echoes of movement, the barely perceptible rhythm of human anxiety. Red herrings, I reminded myself, are merely invitations to look closer, to attend to the whispers beneath the clamor of certainty. The day's lesson, quiet and persistent, was that deception is most convincing when it conforms to expectation, yet truth endures in those details that are overlooked, unremarkable, yet impossible to entirely conceal. It was mid-afternoon when I found myself once again within the rectory, drawn this time by the subtle insistence of human nuance rather than any overt clue. The rector's personal assistant greeted me with measured civility, her hands folded lightly atop a stack of correspondence, eyes alert yet cautious. There is an art to observation in Oxford that requires patience and an openness to the quiet intricacies of manners, for even the most unobtrusive gesture may conceal depth of knowledge or intent. She spoke of routine, of appointments carefully noted, of letters dispatched and received, all in the cadence of one accustomed to protocol. Yet I noticed the slight hesitation when I mentioned the absent dinner guest, the barely perceptible pause in her rhythm, the way a hand brushed against the edge of a desk as though gathering composure. It is in such subtle faltering that human truth often emerges, concealed beneath formality. I allowed the silence to stretch, giving weight to what was unsaid as much as to her careful words. A letter lay unopened on the desk, addressed in the rector's own hand. I observed the crease in the paper, the gentle indentation of a fingertip pressing down upon the wax seal, suggesting the act of handling with both care and restraint. The assistant's eyes flickered toward it, though she said nothing. A minor detail, the tilt of her head, the rhythm of her breathing hinted that this correspondence bore significance beyond its apparent ordinariness. I filed it mentally, the quietest of cues but no less informative. We spoke then of the interpersonal atmosphere within the household minor grievances, subtle rivalries, the way pride and propriety intertwined. Her description was careful, measured, yet occasional slips betrayed the shadow of emotion beneath. I noted the repetition of certain phrases, the echo of past interactions, and the way references to the rector's past occasionally sharpened in tone. It is in these repetitions, in the small oscillations of speech and gesture, that one discerns motive and tension, even when cloaked in courtesy. At one point, she drew a book from the shelf, an unassuming volume with margins filled with annotations in a delicate hand. I observed the curling of the pages, the smudge of ink on a thumb, the subtle alignment of a reference that connected to the misquoted lines I had noted previously. The alignment was almost imperceptible, yet compelling the human mind, leaves traces, even when intentions are concealed. I considered the implications quietly, noting the way her gaze lingered on the text before returning to my own, as though weighing the significance of disclosure. We discussed the patterns of daily life, the subtle orchestration of movement and presence within the rectory, and in her quiet explanations, the dimensions of emotional restraint became evident. Pride, fear, loyalty, and regret all intersected within the routine she described. The gestures of others noted almost in passing, yet carrying layers of unspoken meaning. One must attend closely, for in Oxford, as elsewhere, the minutiae of habit often betray deeper truth. By the time I left, the light had begun to fade through the high windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The assistant's presence remained in my mind, a subtle barometer of tension and knowledge, her carefully measured phrases and gestures leaving traces that would later illuminate connections obscured by propriety. In considering her movements, her choice of words, and the hints of concealed understanding, I recognized that the rectory held more than manuscripts and letters. It contained human patterns, subtle yet revealing, waiting for patience and quiet attention to unfold. And it is in observing these patterns that one begins to perceive the undercurrent of events that even the most decorous household cannot entirely conceal. By mid-afternoon, I found myself retracing steps through the college corridors and the quiet library, compelled by the sense that a minor detail had been overlooked, something so slight it had escaped attention amid the more conspicuous anomalies. The daylight filtered unevenly through the high windows, casting long shadows across worn flagstones and polished wood, and the faint scent of ink and dust hung in the air. One develops an awareness in Oxford of the resonance between human movement and environment. The creak of a floorboard, the tilt of a page, the subtle smear of dust can signal far more than words ever do. I returned to the diary, noting a marginal annotation I had initially dismissed. The curvature of the handwriting, the slight pressure of the pen, suggested urgency tempered with care. Comparing it with the misquoted line from the rector's note, a small flicker of recognition occurred. The alignment was too precise to be coincidence. I realized that the sender had intended the misquotation to appear accidental, yet in pairing it with the diary annotation, a deliberate pattern emerged. Human intention often reveals itself in repetition, even when disguised beneath civility and erudition. Lewis joined me without comment, observing as I traced my finger along the spine of a volume, noting the slight indentation of a bookmark, its presence overlooked in prior examinations. It suggested a previous visitor, careful in manner, yet leaving a trace insufficient to register without deliberate attention. One learns that the human hand, no matter how practiced in concealment, invariably leaves subtle testimony of its passage. I considered the ledger, the misaligned entry I had previously flagged as a potential red herring. On closer inspection, a minor ink blot on the margin corresponded with the margin note in the diary, an unintentional signature of behavior. It was the sort of triviality that might seem inconsequential, yet in Oxford, the alignment of such trifles can illuminate motive and opportunity. Patterns accumulate in layers, quiet yet persistent, until the observer discerns coherence where others perceive disorder. A glance at the study revealed small traces of recent activity, the chair slightly out of place, the gentle indentation of the rug, a faint smudge of dust along the edge of a ledge. Such minor inconsistencies speak to human presence and action, often contradicting spoken assurance or assumed timelines. I noted them meticulously, each small element a piece of the broader mosaic of intent, pride, and subtle concealment. I revisited the minor gestures I had observed among the fellows, the brief hesitation in response to casual questions, the almost imperceptible tilt of a head, the glimmer of recognition that passed across a face. These had seemed unremarkable at first, yet when considered alongside the textual anomalies, they formed a lattice of implication. Human behavior, even under strict decorum, leaves traces that articulate motive without uttering a single word. By evening, as light waned and shadows deepened across the quad, the revisited clues had begun to coalesce into a pattern that was neither sudden nor dramatic, but quietly insistent. The diary annotation, the misquotation, the ledger ink blot, and the small gestures all suggested the presence of a deliberate mind, methodical, yet subtly fallible. Each minor detail contributed to a lattice of understanding that demanded patience, observation, and a willingness to read the spaces between actions. In Oxford, truth rarely arrives in declaration. It whispers through small errors, fleeting gestures, and the faintest echo of intention. The evening chapel was quiet, the sort of silence that presses upon the mind with a weight both contemplative and uneasy. Light from the stained glass windows filtered through in muted colors, catching on the polished pews and the worn stone floor, and the faint scent of candle wax mingled with the lingering chill of approaching night. I arrived early, allowing myself to absorb the subtle rhythm of the space, the creak of floorboards, the occasional whisper of a footstep, the distant tolling of a bell from the tower. Oxford has a way of making one aware of the smallest movements, the faintest irregularities, and in this stillness, the stage was set for the quiet unraveling of concealed truths. The key figures were already present in their seats, arranged with an almost ritualistic precision. The rector, poised yet anxious in a manner restrained by long habit, allowed his gaze to flick toward the empty chair at the side. There was no need for formal introduction. Everyone was aware of the absence, and the tension hung as tangibly as the candlelight. I moved among them, noting gestures, the tilt of heads, the subtle interplay of glances. One must attend to such nuances, for human behavior rarely deceives completely, even when words do. I began with observation, permitting the silence to draw responses without overt questioning. The junior don's hand lingered on a hymnal, a small tremor betraying the discomfort beneath polite composure. Another fellow adjusted his spectacles, eyes momentarily fixed on a corner of the chapel, as though seeking reassurance from a stone angel. I noted the alignment of gestures with previous anomalies, the misquotation, the dust streaks, the misfiled diary page. Each minor detail, previously isolated, now began to resonate, forming a lattice of suggestion that hinted at the orchestrator of tension. A confession, if such it might be called, was never demanded with force. Rather, it emerged through the convergence of observation, timing, and the quiet accumulation of gestures. The faint hesitation before responses, the way voices softened when discussing the absent guest, the almost imperceptible acknowledgement of past slights all indicated not simply motive, but an emotional architecture that explained the orchestration of deception. In Oxford, one learns that confrontation rarely requires harsh words. The truth, if attended to, reveals itself in the spaces between speech and silence. I allowed the assembly to process the subtle cues, watching how each participant absorbed the implications of those small observations. A slip of the hand, a breath held too long, a glance that strayed each contributed to the silent dialogue that the chapel, with its high arches and quiet authority, seemed to conduct on its own. The misquoted lines, the diary annotations, the minor irregularities of daily routine, together they formed a pattern that was undeniable yet understated, the sort of intellectual symmetry that rarely announces itself with fanfare. As the light shifted, deepening the shadows across the pews and altar, the truth became perceptible not in revelation, but in recognition. The subtle orchestration of pride, secrecy, and carefully maintained decorum had been maintained with great skill, yet even the most meticulously constructed misdirection cannot entirely erase the traces of human intent. The individual responsible revealed themselves not through confession, but through the quiet alignment of the evidence, gesture, and context. By the time I departed, the chapel had returned to its hushed stillness, the patterns of human behavior having quietly testified to themselves. Shadows lingered on the floor, echoing the residual tension of revelation, and I noted the faint smile of comprehension upon the rector's lips, the careful readjustment of his gown, the subdued nods among the fellows. In Oxford, confrontation is rarely loud or dramatic. It is measured, deliberate, and quietly devastating. The evening closed with the recognition that truth, though sometimes delayed, emerges inexorably in the careful observation of the smallest, most unremarkable details. By the time the dust had settled, Oxford had resumed its quiet rhythms, though the subtle traces of disruption lingered like a faint echo in the stone corridors. The rectory, now illuminated by the soft glow of late afternoon, felt less like a scene of suspense and more like a space that had quietly endured its own human complexities. I wandered through the familiar halls, observing the polished floors and the faint impressions left by hurried footsteps, each mark a testament to the imperceptible stirrings of tension and revelation. The rector moved among his fellows with a measured composure, gestures precise, voice calm, yet I could not help but note the almost imperceptible relief that shadowed his eyes. The absent dinner guest had returned to the realm of consideration rather than intrigue, the mystery of presence and absence folded into the routines of the household. And yet, subtle irregularities persisted in the slight dust patterns along the edges of the carpet, a book replaced at an angle slightly askew, the lingering echo of gestures performed under duress, all remnants of the narrative that had quietly unfolded. Lewis and I sat in the study, the diary and letters laid out before us, the room steeped in the warm, musty scent of paper and ink. The rectory's careful order, once disrupted by the misquotation, the misaligned ledger, and the delicate web of human intention, now seemed restored, though the restoration was more a settling than a resolution. Patterns of behavior, once tense and taut, had relaxed into recognizability, yet the subtle traces of emotion, the hints of pride, restraint, and quiet regret remained, delicate as cobwebs in the corners of a dimly lit room. I found myself reflecting on the minor details that had threaded through the case, a smudge of ink that suggested care or concealment, the slight misalignment of a manuscript page, the tremor in a gesture unnoticed by all but the most observant. Each had contributed to a narrative that was both intellectual and human, a lattice of motive and behavior that revealed as much about the participants as it did about the event itself. In Oxford, the echoes of small actions often endure longer than the noise of dramatic moments. The rector moved past the study, adjusting a curtain and allowing the late light to fall upon the polished surfaces. I noted the dust on his shoes, now imperceptible to the casual eye, but still present, a subtle reminder of movement, of contact with the world beyond propriety. There is a poetry in such minor traces, an enduring whisper of the ordinary that frames human endeavor. Even in resolution, one observes the marks left by pride, hesitation, and care, and in doing so recognizes the quiet persistence of truth amid the routines of life. I rose to leave, allowing my eyes to linger upon the study, the corridors, and the quad beyond the windows. The day's subtle revelations had concluded, yet the intellectual and emotional residue remained, a quiet hum beneath the normalcy of restored order. Oxford's architecture, its light, its shadows, had observed as much as any individual, bearing silent testimony to the unfolding of human intention and restraint. As I departed, the spires glinted in the fading sunlight, the river murmured in soft undertones, and the faint scent of autumn leaves mingled with the lingering warmth of old stone. The dust had settled, yet the memory of its disturbance persisted, gentle and persistent, much like the lessons of observation and patience that the city imparts. And I realized, as I often do in such moments, that human behavior leaves traces that endure longer than certainty, that speak more eloquently than explanation, and that in the quiet ache of intellect and emotion, one finds the most enduring understanding of all.